Thank you everyone for joining us in our final talk in the online series accompanying Cosmopolis, the Impact of Refugee Art Dealers, which is the current exhibition at Ben Uri Gallery. My name is Helena Cuss. I'm a PhD student at Kingston University
and I'll shut the door.
Research Unit and the curator of Cosmopolis. If you have your microphone or your video switched on, could you please turn them off because this is being recorded? And if you could keep them off for the duration of the talk, that would be much appreciated. So I'm delighted to be introducing our speaker today. Lucy Wassensteiner is Junior Professor in the Art History Department at the University of Bonn in Germany. Lucy wrote her doctoral dissertation at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, which was a provenance-based study of the 1938 London exhibition, 20th Century German Art. She's worked as a researcher and author for the Tate Gallery and as associate lecturer at the Courtauld. She was previously lecturer at the University of Bonn, and from 2020 to 2024, Lucy was director of the Liebermann Villa in Berlin, a museum dedicated to the German painter Max Liebermann. Her recent publications include Sites of Interchange, Modernism, Politics and Culture Between Britain and Germany, 1919 to 1955, and the exhibition catalogue Grete Ring, Kunsthändlerin der Moderne, and it's about Grete Ring that Lucy is going to speak today. So Lucy will speak for about 45 minutes and we'll then have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So please do pop your questions, comments, observations as they occur to you in the chat box. And apologies for the noise coming from my house, if you can hear that. And I will put your questions to Lucy at the end. As I just said, this talk is being recorded, so please ensure that your mics and cameras remain switched off for the duration. And I'm now going to hand over to Lucy.
Great, thanks very much, Helena. And I hope that everybody can hear me okay and that you can all see my presentation. Thank you for the invitation to give this presentation today. As you mentioned, my name is Lucy Wassensteiner. I'm currently working here in Bonn, and what I'd like to talk to you about today is the art dealer Grete Ring, born in Berlin in 1887, who was then forced into British exile in 1938 for reasons of her Jewish heritage. Grete Ring was the subject of a research and exhibition project which I led in my previous role at the Liebermann Villa Wannsee in Berlin. I've been here in Bonn since May, but this topic and this kind of topic remains very relevant for my work also here in Bonn because, of course, study of the art market, how collections are built and dispersed, is centrally relevant to provenance research. So it's great that I get the chance to kind of revisit this material again today and talk to you all about it. And just to start with a little bit of advertising for our team here at Bonn, I wanted to mention, and I hope that has moved on the screen. That's right. So we run here in Bonn a master's program in provenance research on the history of collecting, the only program in Germany that's in collaboration between the art history department and the law department, now in its 5th year. So if anybody is interested in taking part in this 2-year program, please feel free to drop me a line, or you can also see there our website where you can learn more about it. So back to Grete Ring. As I say, this project started as a research and exhibition project at the Liebermann Villa in Berlin. And at the Liebermann Villa is a museum dedicated to the German Impressionist artist Max Liebermann. And we knew the name Grete Ring. We'd heard the name, mainly because Grete Ring was a niece of Max Liebermann. Her mother was a sister of the artist's wife, Martha. We also knew that Grete Ring had a connection with one of Liebermann's most important dealers, Paul Cassirer, and that she had worked at Cassirer's company, the Kunstsalon Cassirer, his dealership, in early 20th century Berlin. And I'm showing here a photograph of the opening wall of our exhibition where we kind of displayed the main protagonists. So you see a large photograph in the centre, Grete Ring. Below her, kind of close-up portrait, Paul Cassirer. And the other 2 figures we see here are Walter Feichenfeld and his wife, Marianne Feichenfeld, born Marianne Breslauer. We know that Grete Ring had entered Cassirer's business shortly after the First World War, working alongside Walter Feichenfeld. And as I say, she then was also friends with Marianne Breslauer, who later married Walter Weichenfeld. So this was the kind of network we were working with as we attempted to research a little bit more about Grete Ring's life. Beyond these kind of points that we already knew, this connection with Max Liebermann, this connection with Cassira, there were many, many questions left unanswered about Grete Ring. She was really something of an unknown when we started this research. It turned out that she had never married. She went into exile, as I mentioned, in 1938. She died in 1952, leaving no spouse, no children, and a portion of her papers, many of the materials that she managed to take with her from Berlin to London, were then inherited by Walter Weichenfeld and his wife, Marianne. And these materials were now in the possession of Walter and Marianne's children, 2 sons. And this family, the Weichenfeld family, then approached us at the Liebermann Villa asking if we would be interested in looking at these materials to find out more about Grete Ring, which of course we very much were. We were able to get some funding from the Berlin Senate to expand the research between Britain and Germany, and the results of the research then flowed into the exhibition. And I'm also just showing here our exhibition catalogue, which Helen has already mentioned, which also gives a more detailed look at what we found out. It was really remarkable what we were able to find out about Grete Ring, her achievements, her network, her reputation as a dealer on the European, the German and British art market from the 1920s through to the early 1950s. And we really had the feeling that we'd only scratched the surface as we were going through this material. And what I'd like to do with the presentation today is to try and give some sense of what we found, of her career, and of how we conducted the research. So looking at what kind of sources we were able to find, and then to ask the question, why has she and her impact been somewhat overlooked in the years since her death in 1952? Is it just as simple as she was a woman working in a man's world, or were other factors at work? This is, of course, a complex question, but in the time I have, I'd like to approach this question by looking at her biography, what we managed to find out, and returning again and again throughout the presentation to Grete Ring's connections with one particular artist, namely the painter Oskar Kokoschka. So asking the question, what do her interactions with Kokoschka throughout her career, the evidence left of them today, tell us about Grete Ring's career and how it's been remembered? So first, a few biographical details. The City Archives of Berlin confirmed that Grete Ring was born in the city in 1887. Her father was a prominent lawyer, later judge, Victor Ring, born to a Protestant family, and her mother, Margarete, was born to the prominent Berlin Jewish Markwald family. So Margarete Markwald, and as previously mentioned, one of Margarete's sisters was Martha Markwald, who went on to marry Max Liebermann. So the family moved in wealthy cultural circles, and as was typical at this time, as a child, Grete Ring had her portrait painted, in this case by the Berlin painter Dora Hitz. Another small little advert for the Liebermann Villa. In October, they're opening at the Liebermann Villa an exhibition dedicated to Dora Hitz, the first solo exhibition of Dora Hitz's work since the 1920s. So Grete Ring was an only child, and she grew up in the centre of Berlin, and she was a close friend of Max and Martha's only child, Grete Liebermann, her cousin, who was 3 years younger. And among the materials we found in the partial estate of Grete Ring were, for example, these fantastic photographs, obviously taken on a holiday. Grete Ring photographed by Grete Liebermann and the other way around, probably on holiday in Southern Europe, maybe Switzerland, maybe Northern Italy. And it was really wonderful to see these 2 young women in this kind of relaxed state. So on the left, Grete Liebermann, and on the right with the kind of headscarf, Grete Ring. And of course, these are then photos we know that Grete Ring took with her into British exile and then passed on after her death. It was clear that Even as a young woman, as a teenager, Grete Ring was very intelligent. She was sent to the higher grammar school for girls in Berlin and completed the school leaving certificate in 1906. And her friend Marianne Breslauer wrote later in her memoirs how, I quote, Grete Ring spoke a great deal about her school days and how easy it all was for her. She went on to study, which again was not typical for women at this time, studying art history, archaeology, German literary history, and philosophy at the universities in Berlin, and then completing her PhD in 1912 in Munich, where she was supervised by the legendary art historian Heinrich Wölfflin. The topic of her dissertation was Dutch portraiture of the 15th and 16th centuries. Directly afterwards, Grete Ring started her career as an art historian in 1913 with a position as a curatorial assistant at the National Gallery in Berlin. She then moved on to the Bavarian State Collections in Munich, where she worked until the outbreak of the First World War. During the First World War, she was able to continue her work as an art historian, for example, assisting with the registration and protection of cultural assets in Belgium. And the war years also saw the first of her academic publications, articles and reviews in the contemporary art historical press. And what's fantastic nowadays is that many of these articles you can track down, of course, because many of these old journals have now been digitized. One example here are the many, many digitized publications available via the University of Heidelberg, which was a really important source for us during this research. So when the First World War ended, Grete Ring was around 31 years old. And it was around this time that she began contributing to exhibitions at the dealership of Paul Cassirer in Berlin. It seems that she was recommended to the dealership by Max J. Friedländer, who was at that time the director of the Berlin Graphics Collection. Friedländer and Ring were clearly in contact while she was writing her PhD because she thanks him in the acknowledgements, and she was then recommended to Cassirer by Friedländer. In 1920, we see the first references to Ring working for Cassirer in the art press. So she's perhaps mentioned in association with a particular exhibition or sale. And then from 1924, she appears in the city's trade records as a partner of the firm, alongside Cassirer and alongside Walter Weichenfeld. So the first connection with Kokoschka that I'm going to talk about today comes in 1926. Already before Grete Ring had joined the Cassirer dealership, Kokoschka was one of the most important, one of the key artists promoted by the firm. The artist's first Berlin exhibition took place at the Kunstsalon Cassirer in 1910. It was Cassirer who published Kokoschka's 4 dramas, for example, in 1919. And after Grete Ring joined the firm, these Kokoschka projects continued. A large exhibition on his landscapes in 1925, for example, or the exhibition we see here, an exhibition and auction or sale of Kokoschka drawings staged in 1926 together with the firm of Hugo Helbing in Munich. We see here the catalogue. In the materials for this exhibition, Grete Ring isn't named, and indeed that was typical for most of the catalogues and brochures produced by the Kunstsalon Cassirer at this time. Her colleague Walter Weichenfeld isn't named either. And indeed, looking at this catalogue, one would think that Paul Cassirer had himself held the auction, although by October 1926, when it took place, Cassirer had already been dead for 10 months. On the 7th of January 1926, Paul Cassirer had committed suicide at the age of 54. His wife, the famous actress Tilla Durieux, had filed for divorce, and Cassirer shot himself in his lawyer's office while discussing the separation. The death caused headlines across Europe. Again, we see one of the headlines from Britain that we managed to find through the digitized newspaper collections. But Cassirer had obviously been a very well-known name, even in England at this time, largely because of the role that he and his cousin had played 20 years earlier in the founding of the Berlin Secession, but also then as a result of the dealership to the 1920s. So following Cassirer's suicide, Grete Ring and Walter Weichenfeld took over the Kunstsalon Cassirer together, keeping its name. And it was clear that the success of the company would then continue uninterrupted. Through the 1920s, Ring and Weichenfeld organised a series of important exhibitions and auctions from highly prominent Berlin collections. Grete Ring was not only selling for collectors and artists, she was also part of their network, counting many of them as friends. And Kokoschka was certainly part of this network. They were close enough for Kokoschka to paint Grete Ring's portrait sometime likely around 1923. This fantastic watercolour was almost certainly a gift for Grete Ring, but we don't know anything about its provenance. It was found by chance during our exhibition preparations by searching through auction catalogues and online auction results. Luckily, we were able to make contact with the owner who provided the piece for our exhibition. I think what's so fantastic about this portrait is not only that it evidences this friendship between the dealer and the artist, but also the way that Grete Ring is portrayed here. The clothing and whether it's short hair or some kind of cap that she's wearing are very modern. But also the expression on Ring's face, I think, tells us something about Kokoschka's assessment of her personality. It's not beauty that stands in the foreground here, it's a kind of thoughtfulness, a kind of intelligence, certainly that's how I read it. So when one researches around the activities of the Cassirer firm at this time, and indeed the art market in Berlin more generally, it's clear that Grete Ring and Walter Feigenfeld were indeed very well known as the faces of the Kunstsalon Cassirer, in particular after Cassirer's death. And we can learn something about their perception through these artistic depictions. One example I'd like to show is this caricature. The pair, here we should see it a little larger. The pair were clearly so well known that they could be caricatured in the art press without even being named. We see here a drawing published in the journal Kunst und Künstler, so Art and Artists, in 1928, covering a major auction staged jointly between the Kunstsalon Cassirer and again Hugo Helbing. And here we see the protagonists, clearly recognisable, the bespectacled Helbing standing in the middle, and the dashing Feigenfeld by his elbow, and the somewhat sceptical looking Grete Ring, again with this short hairstyle or cap. Again, the way Ring is depicted here gives us clues about how her personality was perceived. She was clearly known for her directness, that she didn't suffer fools gladly. I'm going to quote here again Marianne Breslauer writing in her memoirs from the 1980s. She writes, Grete Ring was an absolutely unusual woman, irresistible, admired by everyone, and indeed a little feared, because she was afraid of nothing and of no one. And further, she was feared by many for her disarming directness. It seems that this impression of Ring was shared by a number of others. She was already known in Berlin of the 1920s by the nickname The Witch, even by her own friends. And by the 1920s, Ring was using this nickname for herself in her own letters. Breslauer later wrote that this name came from Ring's habit of regularly flying with aeroplanes, which at that time was very unusual. But the name appears with such regularity, one wonders if this also has something to do with how this circle at this time found a way to deal with this obviously unusual, different woman. And then in turn, whether this came to have an impact on how she was remembered by her contemporaries after her death. But it really does seem that despite this perhaps unflattering nickname, Grete Ring was popular in the Berlin of the 1920s. And we see this, for example, from the visitors she welcomed to her summer house in Sacro, a small village on the River Havel, around 30 kilometers southwest of Berlin. Ring bought this plot of land for herself in the summer of 1927 and had a house built there by her friend, the architect Wilhelm Bühning. The building was finished in 1928. As we can see, the building was moderate in size, strictly modernist in style, consisting essentially of one living room, a small maid's room, a bathroom and a kitchen. There survive some interior photographs from the time. We can see that Ring slept and worked in the single main room, which contained furniture of a similarly modernist style, including chairs designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe in 1927 for the Weissenhof settlement in Stuttgart. We know that Grete Ring was already building up an art collection at this time, a private art collection, but interestingly, this was not displayed in the house at Sacro, maybe for security reasons because she wasn't there all the time, but also partly to be in keeping with this kind of plain modernist aesthetic. Ring regularly entertained friends at Sacrum. We have photographs from Marianne Bristol from this period that show this kind of lively social life at the house. So Ring was well known. She enjoyed an extensive network of friends and colleagues who she often entertained. And of course, the fact that she was able to build this summer house for herself is also a testament to her success and her success in the Cassira business. Yes, she came from a fairly wealthy family, but she was certainly earning well in her position at the business. So by the late 1920s, Grete Ring's success and her personality were being recognised abroad. In 1928, she was involved with another high-profile Kokoschka project, this time a solo exhibition of his paintings staged at London's Leicester Galleries. This was a really significant early showcase for Kokoschka in London, with 34 oil paintings on display. A good number of the works were sold, and the exhibition was also recognised as a success in the German press. We found a review, for example, in one Cologne newspaper, which described it as follows, I quote, "For the first time, London had the chance to see an expressionist artist. One can say that no private exhibition of the last few years has enjoyed such crowds on its opening day as this one, and no exhibition in recent times has attracted so much general interest." Again, looking at these exhibition materials, you would have no idea that Grete Ring had anything to do with this show. Luckily, there exists an article from the Yorkshire Post published to coincide with the opening of the show, which confirms Grete Ring's central involvement. You can see just at the bottom here where the column about Grete Ring starts. The article was written by the journalist Sybil Vincent and appeared in the Yorkshire Post's column for Women of Today. Vincent describes Ring in the article as follows, quote, "The only woman art dealer in Europe of real importance, as far as I know, one of the foremost living experts on the Flemish school of painting. But Frau Ring does not concentrate entirely on old masters. Pictures by the most modern painters of every school are frequently shown at her gallery in Berlin. At the moment, she is in England for the exhibition which she has arranged at the Leicester Galleries of the pictures of Oskar Kokoschka." Vincent was clearly enamoured by the then 41-year-old Grete Ring, as she described her further, quote, "A small, neat figure, always very well dressed, still young enough to enjoy work and pleasure to the full. She begged to be taken to dinner, and once there, if I hadn't bothered her to talk about her career, she would have enjoyed herself like a child." The article goes on to briefly explore Ring's position as a woman dealer on the European art market. Ring is quoted, for example, as follows, "No, I don't think there are any other established women art dealers, with the exception perhaps of your Miss Dorothy Warren." And if any of you are interested in Dorothy Warren, Ulrika Meyer-Stump has written an article about her in the volume that was mentioned earlier, Sites of Interchange. But returning to the Vincent article, women are involved in dealership businesses, Ring explains, but mainly as support for their husbands. And she's asked then why she thinks this is, and she's quoted by Vincent as follows, "I suppose it's chiefly a matter of luck. Of course, being an art dealer is a hard life. I'm continually travelling from one country to another. It's difficult to enter the big firms, and few big women possess sufficient capital to start on their own. Anyhow, to start a new venture of this kind nowadays requires an almost superhuman ability and knowledge." Clearly, however, Ring was not too comfortable ruminating on the particular difficulties faced by women in the art market. Vincent's article concludes as follows. "At this point, Frau Ring declined to say anything more about herself or discuss the possibilities of the art expert's career for women. She returned to the Austrian painter whose pictures she is delighted to have helped assemble in London." This is the only evidence we've found about Ring speaking about the specific challenges facing women on the art market. Clearly, it was unusual for a woman to have such a career as Grete Ring at this time, but there's no evidence that Ring actively advocated for women to be more present on the market, and even in Vincent's article, we sense her reluctance to speak in detail on the topic. But Ring was clearly very confident in her abilities as an art historian and as a dealer. And as further evidence of this, I'd like to refer briefly to the role played by Grete Ring in one of the most scandalous forgery cases of the time, the so-called Wacker forgeries. So Berlin of the mid-1920s, there was a kind of explosion of interest in the works of Vincent van Gogh, perhaps prompted by the publication of the first Van Gogh catalogue raisonné in 1928 by the art historian Jacob Bart de la Faye. Exactly around this time, there appeared then on the Berlin scene a young dealer by the name of Otto Wacker, with a fantastic collection of Van Gogh paintings. The works were previously undocumented, but Wacker was supported by the author of the catalogue raisonné, La Faye, and so the works were assumed to be genuine. In 1927, Wacker organised an exhibition of his collection in Berlin, and so when Ring and Fleichenfeld came to organise their own Van Gogh exhibition for the Kunstsammlung Kassierer, planned for January 1928, they naturally requested loans from Otto Wacker. In total, Ring and Fleichenfeld were able to gather 92 pieces for their Van Gogh exhibition, around half of which came from the Van Gogh family. Additional works came from private collections in Berlin, Dresden, Luzern, New York, and 6 from the collection of Otto Wacker. The Wacker works were in fact the last to arrive at the rooms of the Kunstsammlung Kassierer, and it was Grete Ring who was there to supervise the unloading. It was for her immediately clear, as she later wrote, that the Wacker pictures were distinctly different from the loans secured from the Van Gogh family. As Ring later wrote, and I quote here, "It was immediately clear that the pictures were wrong. Against the shimmering background of the real pictures, they stood helpless and pitiful like cotton patches on a brocade rope." Ring and Fleichenfeld refused to accept the pictures and reported Wacker to the police. And there followed a lengthy trial. Here we see one of the photos from the Landesarchiv in Berlin, which captured the Berlin press for weeks. Art experts from museums, from the art market, were asked to consider the fakes, to pass judgment on Wacker's involvement in their production. Grete Ring and Walter Fleichenfeld were called to the stand. And Ring later published an extensive article on her involvement for the renowned Berlin art journal, Kunst und Künstler. As it turned out, Otto Wacker, who we see here on the far right seated, had a brother who made his living painting theatre sets in Dusseldorf. And when the studio of his brother was raided, the police found further Van Gogh copies. Wacker was then sentenced in 1932 in the end to a year in prison. So as the 1930s dawned, Grete Ring was among the best known and best respected art historians and dealers in Berlin and further afield, the reputation stretching across Europe. She was known for being fearless, confident in her abilities, and with a wide network and wide circle of loyal friends. And indeed, Grete Ring was also prepared to stand up against the developing cultural policies of the National Socialists. Already before Hitler's takeover in January 1933, it was becoming clear in which direction their cultural policy would develop. And so in 1932, the same year of the Wacker trial in Berlin, Ring organised a 3-part series of exhibitions under the title Living German Art, together with the Dusseldorf-based dealer Alfred Flechtheim. These exhibitions showed a broad selection of artists who, within a year, would be featuring in the first propaganda exhibitions of the Hitler regime, and who would be later forced either into exile or to entirely change their way of working. Among the artists included in Ring and Flechtheim's show were Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Wassily Kandinsky, Oskar Schlemmer. Here we see his painting Bauhaus Treppe today in New York that was included in the second of Ring and Flechtheim's exhibitions. Also exhibited the sculptor René Sintenis, the painter Heinrich Campendonck, Otto Dix, as we see here, and Oskar Kokoschka, whose painting Harvest in the Sabina Mountains was also shown in the series of exhibitions. While the choice of artists alone certainly made a statement, the foreword of the catalogue, authored by Grete Ring, made the aims of the exhibition even clearer. I quote here: "It is our aim to show the power that exists within German creativity today, the impacts of which are truly lively, truly alive. Not everything which lives is alive, and not everything which is past is dead. Our aim is to identify the works within the art of our generation which do not deny the great past, but which also guide us towards a distant future. The dividing line between old and new art is random and unjustifiable and serves only to constrain and confuse those who love art. So when one thinks of the art and culture lauded by the National Socialists after 1933, and who had already at this time won seats in local elections, and who were making their kind of backward-looking cultural preferences clear, this was an unmistakable statement. And contrary to the earlier catalogues for this show, Ring was sure to appear as author of the catalogue forward. It was, of course, not only the cultural preferences of the Hitler regime which would come to have a real impact on Grete Ring and her business, however. Both Ring and her business partner, Walter Feichenfeld, and his later wife, Marianne Breslauer, were of Jewish descent and therefore categorized as Jewish under the Nuremberg laws. As a result, following the takeover of power in January 1933, they knew their days in Berlin were numbered. The Kunstsalon Cassira had, in fact, opened a branch in Amsterdam already in 1923, and this was being led in the early 30s by the Dutch art historian Helmut Lutjens. And here we see a photo of Grete Ring, left, Walter Feichenfeld on the right, with Helmut Lutjens in the middle. Shortly after the Nazi takeover, Walter Feichenfeld and Marianne Breslauer left Berlin for Amsterdam. Ring, however, remained in Berlin and took over responsibility for winding up the Cassira business. Her letters from this period suggest that she remained largely in good spirits for the early years at least, as she wrote in the summer of 1934 to her friend, the art historian Julius Held, "I'm sitting here in Sacro, feeling good, and have a lot of visitors." As the 1930s progressed, however, Ring's situation in Berlin became more difficult. She was subject to a series of bans on staging auctions, on selling works, and was ultimately forced to close the business in 1936. In 1938, she left Berlin and emigrated to London. This photograph, taken by Marianne Breslauer Feichenfeld, dates from 1935. It shows Ring, Lutjens, and Feichenfeld on the ship from Calais to Dover on their way to research the possibilities of a new Cassira business in London. And indeed, after her arrival in London in 1938, Grete Ring continued with these plans, acquiring premises for a new business and starting to plan her first exhibition. The new London branch of the Cassira company, the Paul Cassira Limited, opened in the summer of 1939 in premises at 11 Cleveland Row, excuse me, close to Green Park in central London. And the first exhibition opened in July 1939 to coincide with the 15th International Congress of the History of Art and was dedicated to the watercolours of Paul Cézanne. The visitor book from the opening of this exhibition is today held in the partial estate of Grete Ring, and it shows fantastically how quickly Ring was able to make contact with many names of the London art scene, both locals and German emigres. So we see in this first exhibition, the visitor book, we see Herbert Reed, the art historian, we see the then director of the National Gallery, Kenneth Clark, and we see emigres such as the painter Hans Feinbusch, the art historian Edith Hoffmann, and the art critic Carl Westheim. So a great early success for the London business, but of course in September 1939, just 2 months later, comes the outbreak of the war. At this point, international travel became essentially impossible. Walter and Marianne Feichenfeld were by that time married and were living in Switzerland, and so that's where they stayed for the rest of the war, and it was left to Grete Ring, then aged 51, to work on the new London business alone. I'd like to include here a quote from an early letter from Grete Ring in London to Marianne Feichenfeld in Switzerland, dated the 22nd of December 1939, which I think gives a good sense both of how she was making the best of things, but also a certain loneliness. I quote, "I appreciated your long letter very much indeed. It gave me a fairly exact idea of your life and activities. I'm afraid I can't tell you so many news about my social life here. The other day I had a party, beef in the Austrian fashion and Chianti. Everybody seemed satisfied, a dozen people, nearly all art historians, and the new Warburg Institute people. I see quite a lot of these Warburgians now, but I'm afraid they're not quite the thing for parties. I was very much amused by all your news from the different friends. Please give my love to everyone who should care for it. love your old Grete. This extensive correspondence between Ring and Marianne Feichenfeld is today held by the Feichenfeld family, and together with the materials that Ring took to London and then left to the Feichenfeld family, there's really a fantastic pool of information with which we can kind of reconstruct her time in London, and also interesting to see what she felt was important enough to take with her and to preserve. It was, however, essential that we expanded our view beyond these materials and into other archives, into archives of her network and institutions she was linked to. And one example I'd like to flag up here is the artist and illustrator Katie Wilczynski, whose drawing of Grete Ring's business premises we see here. Wilczynski and Ring had known each other already in Berlin. Both came to Britain as emigres after 1933. There's evidence that they lived together for a while in London, and certainly they remained close friends. Wilczynski repeatedly produced these kinds of greeting cards for the Cassira business in London and for Ring personally. And she also drew Ring's portrait, which we managed to find at the Wilczynski estate at the Berlin Art Library. This was drawn in 1949. And I'd like to just briefly mention, after our exhibition at the Liebermann Villa, the museum was actually gifted a little hand-drawn booklet by Wilczynski, which shows a few days in the life of Grete Ring in London in 1940, under the title Tante Hexe Goes to Richmond, so Auntie Witch Goes to Richmond. And Richmond was where Ring was living at this time. So it's absolutely fantastic and must be researched in a bit more detail, but you see here these kind of Grete Ring in her kitchen and taking her dog out. Another contact of Grete Ring's during her time in London was the art historian Max J. Friedlander, who I already mentioned, who we can see rather blurred here in this photograph. As I mentioned, he had been the director of the graphics collection in Berlin between 1908 and 1930. He was also of Jewish heritage and also had to leave Berlin, going into exile in the Netherlands in 1939. And at least during the early war years, Ring and Feichenfeld maintained an extremely extensive correspondence. And this is one of the chapters in our exhibition catalogue looks at this correspondence and this friendship in detail. And what I would just like to mention is also what's great about these extensive letters is you also see how Grete Ring was physically moving around during these years. After her premises in central London were bombed, she moved out to Richmond, and she's staying with various people, apparently friends, acquaintances. She moves around various houses in Richmond. And what we also see from these letters is then after the war, how she continued her business as a dealer and how extensively she travelled in her career as a dealer. One example, between March and September 1949, her letters mention travels to Lisbon, Madrid, Amsterdam, Venice, Dijon, Bern, and Ascona. And the exact extent of what she was doing there is all remains to be researched. We do know that after the war, Grete Ring found a new, more permanent base for herself in London, in a beautiful house on South Street, which we were able to visit, see the outside of it in preparation for the exhibition. Not far actually from her first gallery on Cleveland Road. And we managed to find a quote from the art historian Benedict Nicholson, who also met Ring during these post-war years and wrote later, I quote, her beautiful house on South Street became, after the war, a favourite rendezvous for scholars and intellectuals of every nationality. At her parties in a room full of people, she continued to hold the centre of the stage she had set. This was because she was cleverer and wittier than all with whom she surrounded herself. And her memoir, Marianne Feichenfeld's memoirs from the 80s also confirm this view of the period of Ring's life after the war. Marianne wrote, the post-war years in London were practically the completion of her life's project. She travelled and was respected and recognised everywhere. So it's really fascinating to see what research could be done about this post-war period. And just to kind of conclude this idea of the scattering of the Grete Ring archive. I'd just like to come back again to the connection between Grete Ring and Oskar Kokoschka. This drawing was made by Kokoschka again as a gift for me in December 1951. By this time, Grete Ring was already ill with cancer. She would indeed die the following year at the age of 65 at a clinic in Zurich. Kokoschka writes on the drawing in a fantastic combination of German and English. For mein Gretchen zum Nicolo, so for my little Grete for Christmas, and then in English, be good and cheer up in order that we have a nice party soonest in London, in your house, love, yours, OK, 51. We know from the Kokoschka literature that Grete Ring was active selling for the artist after 1945, but again, the exact extent of this business relationship remains to be researched. And like the watercolour we saw before, the provenance of this drawing between its completion and today is also largely unknown. Again, it was only discovered on the art market decades after Grete Ring's death. So for my last point today, just quickly at the time, I would just like to flag up what are probably the two most significant moments for Grete Ring's professional legacy after her exile to Berlin. This is, on the one hand, only monograph, A Century of French Painting, 1400 to 1500, which was published by Fayardon in 1949 in an English and a French edition. And, as you see on the right, the gift made from her collection of French and German drawings to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford in accordance with her will in 1954. As I mentioned before, this was a collection of around 100 French and German 19th century drawings, many of which Ring had been able to bring with her from Berlin to London. As we researched Ring and her life, it became clear to us that the book A Century of French Painting remained for decades and remains today a standard text for those working in this field. And the gift to the Ashmolean is also recognised and highly valued as the core of their collection in this area. And we see here, for example, how the catalogue of the Ashmolean's drawing collection includes Ring's portrait on the opening pages. But neither of these outputs, if you will, really served to put Grete Ring on the map. Why is this? And a number of factors could be mentioned here, but I would like to draw our attention to one. Both the monograph and the donation were not concerned with the newest modernist developments. It's quite a well-established narrative when we look at the cultural emigres to Britain during this time, that they were kind of bringing modernism to a more old-fashioned Britain, bringing the most modern developments, architecture, etc. This is, of course, not entirely accurate, but nonetheless, it's kind of a very tempting narrative, and it's remained very popular through the 20th and early 21st centuries. So then it brings the question, would Grete Ring have found more renown in post-war Britain, or more renown after her death, if she could more clearly seen as having brought artistic modernism to Britain, as so many of her contemporaries have? If she'd written a monograph about German Expressionism, for example, or donated these kind of works to a British museum, would we know her name somewhat better? A couple of closing thoughts then. Grete Ring was clearly a remarkable figure. Trailblazing woman dealer who managed to build a career in Weimar era Berlin and continue it into British exile. But researching her life, we quickly recognise a number of factors which have obscured her work in the years since. As a dealer, she was, even in Berlin, often working behind the scenes as an intermediary, producing, for example, sales catalogues, which were later, particularly in the years before digitisation, quickly forgotten. Her career was interrupted by exile. Perhaps for this reason, she produced only one monograph during her lifetime. As a successful woman dealer, she was clearly an outlier, unusual, with a direct personality, resulting, for example, in nicknames which arguably undermined her significance. And in British exile, she was not so clearly associated with the newest developments in European modernism, being forced out of Nazi Germany, and although she did work for such artists, and though perhaps for this reason, she falls out of narratives which explore this kind of modernist influence of such emigres on the British scene. Without a family, without a partner, after her death, her archive was scattered. Yes, a large portion was left to the family of Otto Marianne Pfeifferfeld, but significant gaps remain. Luckily for us, Grete was very popular, very successful, and highly respected. And so we've already been able to fill in many of these gaps, and I'm very optimistic that there's a lot more out there that will kind of help us put in the final pieces of the puzzle, exploring her career. So yeah, thanks very much for listening. I'm very happy to take your questions. Yeah, so I guess I will open it up to Helena to read if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was such a rich and like fascinating kind of intimate look at Grete Ring. I think, you know, so like having researched a lot of these emigre art dealers myself, you don't always get access to this amazing resource where you can see personal letters and photographs and really get a feel for the person. And I think you really beautifully kind of like laid out her life before migration, her life after, and all these very complicated kind of crisscrossing connections and networks that she partook in, and make a very convincing thesis for why she isn't as well known as she should be. Something that just occurred to me literally just at the end when you were talking was the fact that she perhaps isn't as well known because she didn't have as much to do with modernism. But I wonder if there's just, as you say, there's still so much to find out. And I mean, I found a fragment in the Tate archive a long time ago that you might have seen, that she, during the war, she sold work by John Piper, who's of course a British modernist, to Kurt Ballantine, another emigre, a German emigre, a friend of hers, dealer in New York, and that she used the gallery of William Oley in London, another refugee art dealer, to that work, because obviously she'd lost her own premises. So I just wonder if there might be further examples like that we just don't know about yet. I mean, someone else has suggested that she might have done the same with Henry Moore, and obviously Kurt Ballantine had started selling more in the 40s, but I haven't personally been able to find anything that verifies that.
No, and I'm sure that stuff is out there, and I think it is just a question of breaking through. And I think we had this remarkable kind of store of information about a person who almost nothing had been written about. I must thank Rahel and Conrad Feichenfeld, who gave us access to this. And Rahel Feichenfeld had written an article about Grete Ring, thinking around 2006 or so, which gave kind of first introduction. But to discover so much new about a person, it was almost like, and as you may know, organising an exhibition, you're under time pressure, and you kind of have to just, okay, we'll focus on what's there and we'll see what we can bring in. But her career could certainly be explored in a lot more detail, and I really am confident there's a lot more out there. And as more gets digitized, then it becomes possible to pick up these tiny scraps, wherever they might be, and kind of consolidate them into a kind of better overview of how she worked and with whom she worked.
Do you know if the Feichenfeld archive has any, do they have any information about the kind of works that she was selling from South Street after the war?
Not as far as I know. It's a lot of more personal correspondence, and the other archives we were able to find do generally go in that direction, although she does discuss artworks. But again, there's I wouldn't rule it out, but not that we necessarily see.
Let's have a look at the chat. If you do have any questions. Oh, here we go. Question from Sarah Dunn. Really interesting, thank you. From the interchanges in the archives, was there ever any discussion about changing or expanding the business name? And were there particular collectors in the UK with whom Ring worked frequently? That's a great question.
Yeah, so I think the question about who she worked with in the UK, we really didn't find anything. But I'm sure, again, if it was a question of going through these materials, stuff will come out, because she was working for a good kind of 15 years in Britain. I think that we found no suggestion of them changing this business name. I think because it was such a brand. I mean, when we researched, for example, Casira's suicide, we found reference. I mean, I think the article I showed us from a newspaper in Gloucester. He was clearly extremely well known, and this is a kind of, especially in the days before the internet, before this kind of marketing possibilities, they certainly weren't going to let that go. And I think that was never in question that they would keep that name. Yeah,
I think it's really fascinating, because I think so much of the narrative is that no one in this country knew anything about the German art world whatsoever. It was almost like a complete blank slate for all the emigres coming here in the 30s. And obviously, as you say, Cassirer actually must have been quite a big public character because his death caused such a sensation.
I mean, I think people also love this story of, a guy shooting himself in his lawyer's office after being served with, I mean, I'm sure that played a part into it, but he was clearly not unknown, and I think that's absolutely.
Yeah, and also interesting that they had managed to arrange a successful exhibition for Kokoschka in 1928, because he again is obviously wasn't received here when he was exiled here, wasn't received here with quite the acclaim that he should have been, given his standing as a German modernist. But he wasn't a complete unknown. And I feel like there must have been something between Kokoschka and Ring when they got here. They must have been working together on some capacity.
Yeah, and I think we found some reference to them being like very close friends at one point, and then having an argument of some kind, because there's some quotes from Kokoschka after Ring dies. There's fantastic letters where Kokoschka is clearly heartbroken, and he kind of, there's this letter to Walter Feichenfeld where he kind of goes, "Oh, I wish it was, it's too gruesome to think of her under the ground, and I wish I was there instead of her," and all this, and there are things like, "Oh, I'm so glad we reconciled," this kind of sentiment. So I think there had been some kind of argument, but they'd reconciled presumably in the late 40s. But yeah.
Wow. Martin Abrahams has a few questions. He asked a while ago, could you repost the information about the Bonn MA connection?
Oh, of course, yes. Thank you for responding to my shameless advertising.
And he has also just asked, were they in the lawyer's office to get a divorce?
Yeah.
See if the shooting. I'm not quite.
Yeah, that's exactly what the situation was, and I think that's kind of why it proved so scandalous.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna flick back to that, but you can find it on the if you Google FPK Bonn, that's our research centre, and there's information there.
Yeah, and also just to say, if you will have done, everyone who's here had signed up to have a ticket, that a recording of this talk will be made available and sent to your email address that you used to buy the ticket at some point when the recording's ready, so can revisit everything that Lucy's just told us again there. So I think we'll probably wrap up there. Thank you so much, Lucy, for such a fascinating talk. Oh, hang on, is that one more question? Just check. That would be great. Okay. It's really nice to finish with a female art dealer who deserves to be much better known, because that's kind of a key theme of the exhibition that we wanted to bring out, is how little is known about women art dealers, but how actually a lot of really important modern art dealers especially were operating in 1940s London and made a huge contribution to its artistic life. And there's so much more work to do on finding out more about them. So that's a really great way to end. The exhibition is on until the 6th of September at Ben Newry Gallery. So if you haven't seen it, please do pay it a visit. It's open from Wednesdays till Fridays, 10 a.m. till 5:30 p.m. So all that remains is to say thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Lucy for a lovely talk, and have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.